my nigga.
Nigger. Nigga. Well,
Right.
same thing, I think. It's just, that's people have told me that's just another way of saying the same thing. Only that's supposed to mean something else, something endearing, I guess. I don't know. I've never had that explained to me, but I think basically it refers to a black person. Well, I have in my word guide, and what I've said for years, that we sometimes called it in the old days the magic word, because when somebody says it under some circumstances, you get a whole bunch of conflict real fast, particularly if it's anything involving white and black people, and the word nigger is used by a white person, then that will trigger some action, conflict, hostile action, as a rule. Now, so some people call certain words as having more power than other words, and that's considered one of the most powerful words in the English language. Now, why is the word powerful? And I have thought for some years now, some decades, and it hasn't caught on, but I think that it's the truth of the matter, in answer to the question, why does that word have power? And I came to the conclusion, it may be the incorrect conclusion. I came to the conclusion, stumbled upon it, by looking at the word and looking it up in dictionaries. The word has no definition. Now, it sounds like it has a definition, but all the definitions I have found, it usually goes like this. Nigger, a derogatory term for a person of the black race, Negro race, African American, etc. A dark-skinned person. Derogatory term, that's the key. The key word in all of that talk is derogatory. Sometimes in italics, sometimes underlined. A derogatory term for a black person. Now, you ask the logical question, why is the word derogatory? It doesn't say why. And when I've talked to people, they're not saying why. It's almost like saying, you're a nigger, and that's derogatory. And if you ask, well, why is that derogatory? And the answer is somewhat vague, like, oh, you don't know, do you? And that's supposed to make you mad. And I can see why. Because any word that doesn't have a clear definition, and you are being called it, and it's supposed to be derogatory, meaning they're saying something awful about you, but you don't know what it is that they're saying awful about you, you might get angry if you get drawn into it. So that's the key to the power of the word nigger. So, what do you do about it? 3 things. These are my suggestions, according to compensatory logic. If a person calls me a nigger in a very calm voice, very calm way, you don't want to throw gasoline on the fire, and you're curious, if you want to react to it, you can choose not to react to it, period, because that's a choice. You can not say anything, not do anything. So what? The world goes on. That had been my choice for many a year. But then I outlined, if I am going to say something, what would I say in response to that? First thing I want to do is get clarity, because that's in any situation that you're in. So you ask the person, what's a nigger? That's the logical question. And the person might say, oh, you're a nigger. I just called you one. And you say, okay. Why are you calling me a nigger? Because I asked you, what's a nigger? And he said, I'm one. So, whatever that is. That's still not answering my question, but, I'm trying to get to the answer. What's a nigger? He says, I'm a nigger, whatever that is. Are you calling me a nigger? Yes, I'm calling you a nigger. And so I say, okay, what's a nigger? Are you calling me a nigger? The answer is yes. What do you think should be done with a nigger? For a nigger? About a nigger? Against a nigger? And let them answer. And ask in all areas of activity. Because at the end of the day and at the beginning of the day, basically what you want to know is not what the person is saying, even though you're asking that person that, but you want to know ultimately what is the person going to do about you being a nigger. Key word here is do, D-O. If you're not going to do anything about me being a nigger, then so what? You can call me anything if you're not going to do anything. And say, well, the person might say, well, like there's an old joke, and I don't want anybody to laugh about this because it's a joke that's not a joke in a way of speaking, because it's supposed to be based on a truthful incident that a person told me about. A fellow told me about it many, many years ago, back in the early 1950s. He said a white man came into a pool hall full of black people, back when they had a lot of pool halls in. And he just walked in a jovial manner and walked right up to the first black person he saw and said, who's the head nigger around here? I'm looking for the head nigger. And so the room went silent. Everybody stopped playing pool and everything. Everybody looked up startled and whatnot. And the person he was talking to looked at him almost with fright in his eyes for the white man who had just walked in and made that announcement. Who's the head nigger in here? I'm looking for the head nigger. And he said, wait a minute, buddy. He said, you don't come in here talking that kind of talk. Do you know where you are? Do you know what you are doing? Do you know what might happen to you? And so then the white man got a little bit frightened, according to the way the story went. He said, oh, I didn't mean to offend anybody. I'm just looking for the head nigger. I got $100 for him. And then it's reported. I don't know whether this is a joke or not, but this is the way it's reported to me. The black guy that he was talking to said, oh, I'm the head nigger. If you don't believe it, ask all the other niggers in here. Now, that's supposed to be a true story. Now, what am I saying by just recounting that? I'm saying, depends on how the person wants to look at the use of the word nigger. That's where the rappers are correct. Why? Because the word has no definition so far. But I gave it one. Now here we get to this bottom line. I say a nigger is a non-white person who is subject to white supremacy. And so that fits me perfectly. When people call me a nigger, I'm looking at it within that context. And if it's a white person doing it, if they recognize that much, that's saying one thing to me, that I'm most likely looking at a white supremacist. Because if he knows that I'm subject to white supremacy, I want him to know that. Yes. And the way for me not to be a nigger is not to be subject to white supremacy. And that's why I'm writing books. That's why I'm having this conversation right now. Because that is a logical definition. That's a definition that I gave it, since it doesn't have a definition. It makes people angry because it doesn't have a definition. Once you give a definition to a word, you can handle it. So I'm giving the word nigger a definition, a logical definition, and a truthful definition. That's the only definition that word can have. that makes sense. I don't know of any other definition that would fit. So a nigger is a person who has been made subject to the system of white supremacy. A non-white person who, naturally, who is subject to the system of white supremacy. I qualify for that. Now, am I saying I'm proud of it? I should go around calling people that, or anything like that? No. Because that's a terrible thing to be. But that's what I am. A victim of white supremacy. It's equivalent to the word victim. If you're not a victim of white supremacy, I don't care how black you are, you can't be a nigger. It's impossible. According to what? According to logic. It's impossible. Once you are out from under white supremacy, it's impossible to be a nigger. Because that's what a nigger is. A captive. A person who has been beaten down because and misused and mistreated because of color. That's the only thing you can possibly be that would make sense, that would fit that word perfectly. Now, does that make it true because I said so? No. But if you think about it and think of all the other characteristics and the way the word has been used for many, many decades by everybody, black and white, in every type of context, I think the average person thinking of the classic definition, the standard definition, a derogatory term for a Negro, African American, etc., 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 I think that's unacceptable. I think a logical term, a term that would actually empower people like Neely Fuller and put the white supremacists on the defensive. See, I'm not just coming up with a quip. I'm talking about you're going on the offense now. When you say, oh, when you call me a nigger, what you're calling me is a victim of white supremacy. I agree with that. That's a description of my status. So you recognize that I am a victim of white supremacy, which is what I've been trying to tell you all the time. Now you're saying that you recognize it. So now that we recognize that, the question is, am I supposed to be that? And the answer is no, which means, since you know so much about what I am, how come you are not working on the project, sir, of getting rid of the system of white supremacy so that I won't be a nigger no more? What do you do every day? How do you spend your time? Why aren't you working on this project that would make you a patriot? Oh, yes, we're talking about patriotism now, because that's another word. How do you get to be a patriot on this system? On this planet, whether you're white or non-white? If you say you're a patriot, you can't believe in white supremacy. That's one of the major requirements, if not the major requirement. According to what? Logic. Why? Because the system of racism is the worst system on the planet. So you can't be a patriot unless you're against the system of white supremacy. You are not patriotic. I don't care how many flags you fly. That's the first order of business. That's one word I'll just switch to right quick. We went from nigger to patriot. Okay? Oh, yes, whether you're white or non-white, if you are not about the business of trying to get rid of white supremacy and replacing it with a system of justice, you are not a patriot. Because that's the biggest problem on the planet. And you are not working on the biggest problem on the planet and calling yourself a patriot, that doesn't compute. So you can just put all those flags down and stop singing all those songs and all like that until you can get on the wavelength where you're supposed to be. And you can say all this to someone who calls you a nigger. You don't fight against that word or fight the person that uses the word. That's not solving anything. You explain what's going on here in this conversation and give it some meaning that will work for what? For a constructive result. That's the procedure.